On a foggy September morning in 1944, a column of German Panther tanks advanced through the rolling farmland of eastern France near the village of Arracourt. These were the most formidable fighting machines in the world, each one representing the pinnacle of German armored engineering. Every Panther carried a 75mm high-velocity gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. The long-barreled weapon could penetrate armor that American shells would merely bounce off. Their frontal plates, sloped at 55 degrees, could deflect most American tank rounds. The crews had been told repeatedly that American Shermans were inferior in every measurable category, undergunned, under-armored, and frankly dangerous to their own crews. The German tankers had good reason for confidence that morning. The fog was so thick that visibility dropped to just a few hundred meters, negating the advantage of American fighter bombers that had been terrorizing German columns throughout the summer. At close range, where the fog would force any engagement to occur, Panther crews expected their superior training and equipment to guarantee victory. Their intelligence reports confirmed that only a single American armored combat command stood between them and their objective. They were about to discover that warfare is not always measured in armor thickness and gun caliber. Within minutes of making contact, American shells began striking the German column from multiple directions simultaneously. Tanks that had been advancing confidently moments before were now burning, their crews scrambling to escape the flames. The Panthers tried to respond, but every time they turned to engage one threat, fire came from another angle entirely. It was as if the Americans could read their minds, anticipating every maneuver before it happened. The Germans were not facing telepaths. They were facing something far more revolutionary, though utterly invisible. Every American Sherman tank carried a radio system so advanced that German engineers would later study captured sets with a mixture of professional admiration and disbelief. While German tank commanders waved colored flags and hand signals to communicate with their platoons, American tankers spoke to each other in real time across distances of 7 miles. While German radio operators struggled with static, interference, and garbled transmissions, American crews enjoyed crystal-clear communication that worked perfectly, even while their tanks were bouncing across rough terrain at full speed. This is the story of how an invisible advantage in electronic communication decided the fate of armored warfare in the Second World War. It is a story of brilliant engineers and stubborn bureaucrats, of industrial might and organizational learning, of men who understood that the army which talks together fights together. The foundation of American radio superiority was laid not in a military laboratory, but in the basement of Philosophy Hall at Columbia University. Edwin Howard Armstrong, born December 18, 1890, had already transformed radio technology twice before turning his attention to a problem that had frustrated engineers for decades. His regenerative circuit had made practical radio receivers possible during the First World War. His super-heterodyne circuit had become the standard design for virtually every radio manufactured anywhere in the world. By his 30s, Armstrong was already recognized as one of the greatest electrical engineers in history. But his most important invention emerged from frustration with a fundamental limitation of existing radio technology. Amplitude modulation, the standard method of radio transmission used by every commercial station and military set, was plagued by static. Every thunderstorm, every electrical motor, every spark plug, every lightning strike generated electromagnetic interference that bled into AM radio signals. Listeners had grown accustomed to crackling and hissing, accepting it as the inevitable price of wireless communication. Engineers had tried for years to eliminate the problem without success. In 1933, Armstrong patented a completely different approach to radio transmission. Rather than varying the strength of a radio signal to carry information, which is what amplitude modulation does, his frequency modulation system varied the signal's frequency instead. The mathematics were elegant, the engineering was complex, the results were revolutionary. FM signals cut through static like a knife through paper. Interference that would completely obliterate an AM transmission simply disappeared on FM. The reason was fundamental to the physics of radio waves. Static affects amplitude far more than frequency. By encoding information in frequency variations rather than amplitude variations, Armstrong had made interference irrelevant. On November 6, 1935, Armstrong demonstrated his invention to the New York section of the Institute of Radio Engineers at the Engineering Society's building. The audience sat in stunned silence as a transmission from a station in Yonkers came through with perfect clarity. They could hear a glass of water being poured, the liquid splashing against the sides. They could hear paper being crumpled, every wrinkle audible. They could hear a musical recording with fidelity that seemed impossible. These were sounds that would have been completely unintelligible over AM radio, lost in the constant hiss and crackle of atmospheric noise. The commercial radio industry, heavily invested in AM technology and the infrastructure that supported it, dismissed Armstrong's invention as impractical. RCA, which had made fortunes from AM broadcasting, actively worked to suppress FM development. David Sarnoff, who had once been Armstrong's friend, became his bitter enemy in corporate boardrooms. But one organization immediately recognized the military potential of static-free communication. Beginning in 1938, Armstrong became a regular visitor to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, home of the United States Army Signal Corps laboratories. Army officers remembered the communication failures of the First World War, when crucial messages had been lost to interference at critical moments. They understood what clear communication meant on a battlefield, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. At Fort Monmouth, Colonel Roger Colton faced one of the most consequential decisions in the history of military technology. Colton served as director of the Signal Corps laboratories, responsible for all Army communication equipment development. The Army was preparing to standardize its next generation of tactical radios. Every tank, every jeep, every armored car, every artillery battery would use whatever system Colton selected. The choice would shape American military communications for the coming decade and potentially determine the outcome of whatever war might come. The safe choice was AM. The technology was proven and understood. Manufacturers knew how to build AM equipment efficiently. Training programs already existed. Every radio operator in the Army had learned on AM sets. Choosing FM meant starting from scratch. Components were more complex and expensive. Manufacturing processes would need complete redesign. Trainers would need retraining before they could train anyone else. The risk of failure was significant. Colton chose FM. His decision was not popular with everyone in the Army bureaucracy. Some officers complained about unnecessary complexity. Some manufacturers protested the retooling costs. Some training officers worried about the transition period when their programs would be obsolete and their expertise suddenly worthless. Armstrong himself later described Colton's choice as the most difficult decision of the history of radio which anyone was ever called upon to make. Colton understood what the skeptics did not. In combat, reliability is worth any price. The clearest order is worthless if interference garbles it into noise. The most brilliant tactical plan fails if subordinates cannot hear it. FM offered something AM could never provide, the confidence that when you pressed the transmit button, your message would reach its destination exactly as you spoke it. During the First Army's summer maneuvers of 1940, 28 experimental FM sets built by Radio Engineering Laboratories of Long Island City proved the concept under field conditions. Tanks churning across rough terrain, engines roaring, weapons firing, and the radios worked flawlessly. The Signal Corps assessment called the results an overwhelming success. On July 22, 1941, 5 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would thrust America into the Second World War, the Army formally standardized the SCR-508 radio for armored vehicle use. The decision was made. America had committed to FM. The revolution in armored warfare communication had begun, though no one yet understood how completely it would transform the battlefield. To support the war effort after Pearl Harbor, Armstrong offered royalty-free use of his FM patents to the War Department. He retained ownership and expected fair compensation after the fighting ended, a reasonable expectation for an inventor whose technology would equip millions of military radios. The subsequent patent litigation, particularly against RCA, would drag on for years. The financial and emotional strain contributed to Armstrong's deteriorating mental state. On the night of January 31, 1954, the man who had given American soldiers the gift of clear communication fell from his 13th-floor apartment at River House in New York City. His wife Marion eventually won the patent cases, settling 21 infringement suits for approximately $10 million by 1967, but too late to save the inventor himself. The technology he created saved countless lives he never knew. The SCR-508 was a marvel of engineering compressed into 181 pounds of rugged military electronics. Operating in the frequency range of 20 to 27.9 MHz, it could transmit voice communications clearly at ranges of 7 miles, while the tank was moving across rough terrain. When stationary with a proper antenna deployed, that range extended to 10 or even 15 miles under favorable conditions. The system offered 10 crystal-controlled preset channels that operators could switch between instantly using a simple selector dial, with 80 total channels available across the frequency band by changing crystals. The transmitter, designated BC-604, produced 30 watts of nominal output power, according to official War Department Technical Manual, TM-11600, more than triple the power of German tank radios. The signal punched through interference, engine noise, and battlefield chaos with a clarity that German tankers found almost magical when they first encountered it. But the 508's most significant feature was its dual receiver configuration. Tank commanders received 2 complete BC-603 receivers, allowing them to monitor both their platoon network and the company command frequency simultaneously. They could listen to orders from above while coordinating with their own crews without ever missing a transmission. When higher headquarters issued a warning about enemy movements, the tank commander heard it instantly while still directing his gunner and driver. The tactical implications were profound. The variant used in most Sherman tanks, the SCR-528, carried 1 receiver instead of 2, sufficient for crews who did not need to monitor multiple frequencies. Both systems shared the same BC-604 transmitter and the same extraordinary reliability that FM technology provided. The channel spacing of 100 kHz allowed multiple units to operate in close proximity without interfering with each other, a crucial feature in the dense radio environment of an armored division. Every Sherman tank rolled off the assembly line with a complete radio installation. Every single one of the 49,324 Shermans produced across 11 American factories. This was not an optional extra or a commander's privilege. It was standard equipment, as fundamental to the tank as its engine or main gun. A Sherman without a radio was as unthinkable as a Sherman without tracks. The production miracle extended beyond just the radios themselves. Crystal oscillators, vacuum tubes, wiring harnesses, microphones, headsets, antenna mounts, and thousands of other components all had to be manufactured in quantities that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. American industry responded with the same energy it brought to producing tanks, aircraft, and ships. Radio factories ran 3 shifts around the clock. Quality control systems ensured that equipment destined for the battlefield would work the first time and keep working under the harshest conditions. The German approach to tank communication could not have been more different. German armored forces primarily used the Fug 5 radio system, operating between 27.2 and 33.3 MHz, using amplitude modulation. The transmitter produced 10 watts of power, less than a third of the American system's output. Under ideal conditions, a Fug 5 could transmit voice messages 2 to 3 kilometers. In the noise and chaos of actual combat, that range often shrank to a few hundred meters of reliable communication. Beyond that distance, voices became garbled, words dropped out, and commanders found themselves guessing what their superiors had actually ordered. Static was a constant companion of German tank radio operators. Engine noise generated electromagnetic interference that bled directly into AM receivers. The electrical ignition systems produced steady crackling. The motors that traversed the turret created spikes of noise every time they operated. Even the shock absorbers and suspension components contributed to the electromagnetic chaos inside a moving tank. German radio operators became experts at interpretation, filling in words they could not actually hear with educated guesses about what their commanders might have said. For longer-range communication, German command tanks used the Fug 8 system with 30 watts of output power. This more powerful set could theoretically reach 140 kilometers, but that impressive range applied only to Morse code transmissions, using a 9-meter antenna with the vehicle completely stationary. Voice communication range was far shorter, approximately 25 kilometers under good conditions. The Fug 8 was primarily useful for communication between battalion or regimental headquarters, not for the fast-moving tactical coordination of a tank platoon engaged with enemy forces at close range. The problems went deeper than the technology of individual radios. Many German tanks carried no transmitters at all, only receivers. The Panzer I, which made up a significant portion of German armor at the war's start, was equipped only with a receiver. It could hear orders, but could not send reports or requests. In September 1939, 1,445 Panzer's were available for the invasion of Poland, and not one of them could transmit a single word. When radios failed, or were never installed, German tank commanders fell back on 19th-century solutions. The H.D.V. 470/7 Training Regulation from May 1941, a comprehensive manual for medium tank company operations, included detailed diagrams of signal flags in its fifth appendix. Colored pennants mounted on tank turrets could convey basic commands. A red flag might mean halt. A yellow pennant might indicate assembly point. In practice, flag signals had severe limitations. They required line of sight between tanks, impossible in fog, smoke, forests, or urban terrain. They required the commander to expose himself from his hatch, making him vulnerable to snipers and shell fragments. They could only convey predetermined messages, not the fluid back and forth of conversation. And they were slow, requiring each tank commander to see the signal, interpret it, and then pass it along to the next vehicle. The internal communication problems inside German tanks were equally severe. Before 1941, German tank intercoms connected only the commander, driver, and radio operator. The gunner, the crew member who actually aimed and fired the main weapon, received orders through a speaking tube or through the commander physically tapping his shoulders in a code of predetermined signals. The loader, whose job of handling heavy ammunition required constant movement inside the cramped turret, was never connected to the intercom system at all. The Panzerkasten 20 amplifier box, introduced in 1941, finally brought the gunner into electronic communication with the rest of the crew. German training materials celebrated this development as a major advance. The Panther Fibel Instruction Manual, an illustrated guide published for crews of the new Panther tank, proclaimed enthusiastically that with the gunner connected, the ultimate dream comes true. German tankers had been fighting for 2 years before achieving what American crews considered basic functionality. American tankers had enjoyed full 5-position crew intercoms, connecting commander, driver, assistant driver, gunner, and loader, since the Sherman's introduction. Every crew member could speak and be heard by every other crew member. The commander could issue orders to the entire crew simultaneously. The entire crew operated as a single coordinated unit, rather than a collection of individuals working in isolation. The technological disparity between American and German tank communications translated into tactical catastrophe for German forces during the Battle of Arracourt, which raged from September 18th through the 29th, 1944. It would become the largest tank battle fought by American forces on the Western Front before the Battle of the Bulge, and it demonstrated with brutal clarity what radio coordination meant in armored combat. Major General John S. Wood, known as Tiger Jack to his troops, commanded the 4th Armored Division. British military theorist Basil Liddell Hart would later call Wood the Rommel of the American armored forces, high praise indeed given Hart's admiration for the Desert Fox. Wood had driven his division across France at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies. After breaking out from Normandy during Operation Cobra, the 4th Armored raced eastward, covering ground so rapidly that supplies could barely keep up. By mid-September, his tanks were probing toward the German border in the Lorraine region, threatening the industrial heartland of the Reich itself. The Germans responded with a massive counterattack intended to blunt the American advance. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel committed the LVIT Panzer Corps to drive the Americans back. 2 newly formed Panzer Brigades spearheaded the assault. The 111th Panzer Brigade under Colonel Bronsart von Schellendorf and the 113th Panzer Brigade under Colonel Erich von Seckendorf together fielded 262 tanks and assault guns. The force included 107 of the fearsome Panthers, 75 Panzer IVs, and 80 self-propelled assault guns. On paper, the German force was overwhelming. The Panthers alone outclassed any American tank in direct combat. Their long 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where American shells would simply bounce off Panther armor. The Germans had numerical superiority in the sector. Everything pointed to a German victory that would stabilize the crumbling Western Front. In practice, the German force was fatally flawed by failures that no amount of superior armor could overcome. The panzer brigades had been assembled hastily to meet the crisis in the West. Germany was hemorrhaging troops on the Eastern Front, in Italy, and now in France. The brigades represented a desperate scraping together of available resources, rather than a carefully prepared force. Their crews had received only 2 weeks of combined training before being sent into battle. Many tank commanders had never maneuvered with their units. According to German General Stumpf, writing after the war, many junior officers had no idea of the commitment of motorized formations. They had never operated together as a coordinated unit before being thrown against one of the most experienced American armored formations in the European theater. Colonel Bruce C. Clark commanded Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division. Under him, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led the 37th Tank Battalion with an aggressive style that would become legendary. Abrams had turned 30 years old just 3 days before the battle began, on September 15th. Despite his relative youth, he had already developed a reputation as one of the finest tank commanders in any army. His unit's supporting cast included the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, the 66th and 94th Armored Field Artillery Battalions, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion armed with M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, and the 25th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Major General Manton S. Eddy commanded 12th Corps, providing strategic direction for the American forces. Brigadier General Otto P. Wayland's XIX Tactical Air Command stood ready to provide devastating air support, though weather would limit flying operations throughout much of the battle. September 19, 1944, dawned with dense fog blanketing the Lorraine countryside. Visibility dropped to a few hundred meters, sometimes less. For the German commanders, this seemed like a gift from Providence. Their Panthers could close to ranges where their superior guns and armor would guarantee victory against the outmatched Shermans. The feared American fighter bombers would be grounded by the weather. For once, German tankers could fight without constantly scanning the skies for diving thunderbolts. They did not anticipate how completely radio coordination would neutralize every advantage they thought they possessed. Captain William A. Dwight, a liaison officer from the 37th Tank Battalion attached to Combat Command A headquarters, was making a routine jeep run near the village of Bastogne-la-Petite when he spotted a German panzer column approaching from Moncourt. He immediately radioed CCA headquarters to report the enemy movement and strength. Colonel Clark directed Dwight to establish a blocking position with a platoon of 4 M18 tank destroyers from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. In the desperate engagement that followed, Dwight's small force destroyed 9 German panzers while losing 3 of 4 tank destroyers. His real-time radio reports had given American commanders precious minutes to reposition their forces against the German attack. Throughout the morning, American tanks used the fog that was supposed to protect the Germans against them. Sherman platoons would emerge from the mist, fire into German flanks before the Panthers could react, and disappear back into the fog before return fire could find them. When German tanks turned to engage one threat, another appeared from a completely different direction. Captain Kenneth Lamison of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, led 4 Shermans to a ridge west of Bastogne-la-Petite and destroyed 8 Panther tanks through coordinated maneuver and constant radio communication with adjacent units. Above the fog, where the ceiling permitted, Major Charles M. Carpenter flew his Piper L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft. Nicknamed Bazooka Charlie by the troops, Carpenter had personally mounted 6 bazooka tubes on his tiny fabric-covered airplane, 3 under each wing, fired via a toggle panel in the cockpit. He used them to attack German armor directly, but more importantly, he provided Abrams with continuous intelligence about German movements that the enemy simply could not match. When fog briefly lifted over one sector, Carpenter dove on a concentration of German vehicles, destroying 2 tanks and sending the rest scattering in confusion. His radio reports guided American armor to the most vulnerable points in the German line. On September 22nd, Captain William Spencer of Company A demonstrated what individual initiative, combined with radio coordination, could achieve. His platoon of 7 Shermans encountered 22 German tanks that had broken through American defensive positions. By any conventional calculation, Spencer should have retreated or been destroyed. Instead, he used terrain, concealment, and constant communication with supporting artillery and adjacent units to turn the engagement into a massacre. His Shermans fired from hull-down positions, exposing only their turrets while the hull remained protected by terrain. When German tanks tried to flank him, Spencer repositioned based on radio reports from other American units that could see the German movement. When enemy vehicles bunched together, Spencer called in artillery that landed among them within minutes. By the time the engagement ended, 17 German tanks were destroyed or burning. Only 5 escaped. Spencer lost a single Sherman. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for this action. The fog that was supposed to be Germany's ally became its doom. German tanks could not coordinate their attacks. Company commanders could not reach battalion leaders through their static-plagued radios. Flags were useless when visibility dropped to nothing. Individual tanks fought individual battles, while American units operated as a single coordinated organism, striking and withdrawing, concentrating and dispersing, always one step ahead of German responses. By the time the Battle of Arracourt ended on September 29th, German losses were catastrophic. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns committed to the offensive, 86 were confirmed destroyed. Another 114 were damaged, broken down, or abandoned when their crews fled. Only 62 German vehicles remained operational, barely a quarter of the force that had begun the attack with such confidence. The 111th Panzer Brigade suffered particularly devastating losses. It had started the battle with 90 tanks and approximately 2,500 men. By the end, the brigade was reduced to 7 operational tanks and roughly 80 survivors. Colonel Bronsart von Schellendorf was mortally wounded on September 22nd at Juvelais and died of his wounds. Colonel von Seckendorf of the 113th Brigade was killed on September 23rd near Lagarde, when his vehicle was struck by a P-47 fighter bomber. American losses totaled 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers from Combat Command A. The 4th Armoured Division as a whole recorded 225 killed and 648 wounded for the entire month of September, including operations beyond Arracourt. The arithmetic of the battle tells its own story. The Germans lost approximately 200 vehicles, destroyed or disabled, while the Americans lost 32. The ratio approached 6-1 in favor of the supposedly inferior American tanks. The outcome at Arracourt did not emerge from nowhere. It represented the culmination of a learning process that had begun in humiliation nearly 2 years earlier in the mountains of Tunisia. In February 1943, American forces met experienced German armor for the first time at Kasserine Pass. The battle exposed every weakness in American tactical doctrine, equipment, and leadership. The broader operation, which included fighting at Sidi Bouzid and Fade Pass, beginning February 14th, resulted in approximately 6,500 American casualties and the loss of 183 tanks. Communication failures contributed significantly to the disaster. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commanded 2 corps from an elaborate underground headquarters complex 70 miles behind the front lines. His facility, built by an entire engineer company, was derisively nicknamed by troops who wondered why their commander was hiding so far from the fighting. More critically, Fredendall's confusing, coded radio orders left subordinate commanders uncertain of their missions. Some units never received orders at all. Others received contradictory instructions. Coordination between units broke down completely as the German attack developed. General Ernest Harman was sent to assess the situation. His devastating after-action report focused primarily on Fredendall's complete unfitness for command, describing him as both a moral and physical coward. Patton took command of 2 corps on March 6, 1943, and immediately began rebuilding both tactical doctrine and troop morale. The recovery came with remarkable speed. At El Gheta, from March 23rd through April 3rd, American forces achieved their first clear victory against experienced German armor in the European theater. A crucial moment came when American signals intelligence intercepted German radio communications, indicating that a 50-tank assault by the 10th Panzer Division was scheduled for after 4:30 in the afternoon. Armed with this advance warning, American commanders positioned their forces perfectly to receive the attack. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, dug in and waiting on ground of their own choosing, destroyed 30 German tanks when the panzers drove into the prepared positions exactly as predicted. Total German tank losses for the day reached 37 vehicles. American forces had learned to use their communication advantage, not just for coordination, but for intelligence. In Normandy, the learning continued. Tank infantry coordination had been a persistent problem since the first combined arms operations. Sherman crews, buttoned up inside their armoured vehicles with hatches closed against shell fragments and sniper fire, could not hear infantrymen trying to warn them about concealed anti-tank positions. The infantry had no way to communicate targets to tank gunners who could not see the same threats the foot soldiers could see. The solution emerged from the field itself. Tank crews mounted EE-8 field telephones in ammunition boxes welded to the rear hull of their Shermans. Infantry squads advancing with the tank could lift the handset and speak directly to the tank commander through the vehicle's intercom system. They could warn of threats, request fire support, or coordinate movement, all while the tank crew remained safely inside their armoured protection. The improvised solution spread through the army with remarkable speed, passing by word of mouth among tank crews who recognized immediately how valuable it was. Official adoption followed, and the tank infantry telephone became standard equipment. By Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, tank infantry phone coordination was routine practice throughout the American armored force. When approximately 1,500 heavy bombers, along with over 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers, saturated German defensive positions west of St. Lo, American armor was ready to exploit the chaos with combined arms teamwork that German forces could not begin to replicate. The bombardment killed Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater, when bombs fell short of the target area. Despite this tragedy, American ground forces attacked into the shattered German defenses within hours. Tanks worked with infantry who talked to them directly. Artillery forward observers rode in the leading tanks and called fire missions within minutes. Fighter bombers overhead received target coordinates from ground controllers. Within days, the German front in Normandy had collapsed completely, and American armoured columns were racing across France in a pursuit that would not stop until they reached the German border. The ultimate demonstration of what radio coordination could achieve came 3 months after Arracourt, during the desperate fighting to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne. On December 20, 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion covered 175 miles in 15 hours, redeploying from the Saar front to counter the massive German Ardennes offensive. The movement was coordinated entirely by radio. There was no time for written orders, staff conferences, or printed maps with phase lines drawn in grease pencil. Abrams received his instructions over the air and transmitted them to his company commanders while his tank was still moving. Fuel and ammunition were arranged through radio coordination with supply units. An entire armoured battalion repositioned across 200 kilometres, guided by nothing but voice communication. 6 days later, on December 26th, Combat Command Reserve under Colonel Wendell Blanchard reached the outskirts of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and attached units had been surrounded since December 20th. The final push required threading through German positions that had encircled the town for a week. Abrams radioed Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armoured Division, requesting permission to launch the final assault. Gaffey gave his approval. Abrams keyed his microphone and transmitted to his battalion the order to attack. First, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding the lead tank, an M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman nicknamed Cobra King, with bumper number C6 designating Company C's 6th vehicle, broke through the German perimeter under heavy fire. At approximately 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26, 1944, Boggess climbed from his tank and shook hands with Lieutenant Dwayne Webster of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, 101st Airborne Division. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The relief operation had been coordinated minute by minute over FM radio. Artillery support was called in real time as tanks encountered resistance. Infantry units reported enemy positions that tanks could not see. When German resistance stiffened in one sector, forces pivoted to exploit weakness elsewhere. The entire operation displayed the fluid adaptability that only instantaneous communication could provide. None of this would have been possible without industrial mobilization on a scale unprecedented in human history. In January 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt established the War Production Board by executive order. The new agency would coordinate the conversion of American industry from consumer goods to military production. The board soon ordered civilian radio manufacturers to cease production of consumer receivers and convert entirely to military equipment. Thousands of workers and hundreds of millions of dollars in productive capacity that had been building home radios for American families shifted to building tank radios for crews who would fight in deserts and forests an ocean away. Paul V. Galvin and his brother Joseph had co-founded Galvin Manufacturing Company in Chicago in 1928. The company, which would later adopt its famous brand name Motorola, had built its reputation on automobile radios. By 1940, Daniel E. Noble had joined as research director. Noble had previously served as an assistant professor of electrical engineering at Connecticut State College, now the University of Connecticut, and had developed the first practical two-way FM radio system for the Connecticut State Police. He understood exactly what mobile military communications required. Under Noble's direction, Galvin's engineers produced some of the most important communication equipment of the war. The company's principal, RF engineer, a Polish immigrant named Henryk Magnuski, who had graduated from Warsaw University of Technology in 1934, held patents on key components of the SCR-300 backpack radio. Magnuski would eventually hold 30 patents and become a fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. By war's end, Galvin Manufacturing had produced 280,565 military radios of various types. The production breakdown demonstrates the scale of industrial dedication. 137,031 SCR, 536 handy-talkie, handheld radios. 46,911 SCR, 300 backpack radios that enabled infantry to stay in contact with supporting armor and artillery. 34,127 SCR, 509 and 510 vehicle radios. 62,496 SCR, 609 and 610 field artillery radios. The company earned the Army-Navy E Award for production excellence 5 times. The Signal Corps itself underwent explosive growth to support the war effort. Personnel expanded from 27,000 before the war to 350,000 at peak strength. The budget grew from modest peacetime appropriations to billions of dollars annually. Training programs graduated thousands of officers and hundreds of thousands of enlisted technicians who would operate and maintain the equipment that connected the American war machine from headquarters to frontline foxhole. Against this industrial mobilization, German production simply could not compete. Total German tank production for the entire war reached approximately 26,000 vehicles of all types. Panther production peaked at 380 units in July 1944, the best month the Germans ever achieved. Total Panther production across the entire war amounted to 5,964 tanks. Tiger I production totaled only 1,347 of the fearsome but expensive heavy tanks. The Americans produced 49,324 Sherman tanks alone. Every single one carried an FM radio that German tankers could only envy. German commanders understood what they faced, though understanding did not translate into solutions. 20 years after the war, at ceremonies commemorating the Battle of the Bulge, General Hasso von Manteuffel met with Brigadier General Bruce Clark, who had commanded the defense of St. Vith during the German offensive. The two former enemies discussed the battle with professional detachment. Manteuffel admitted that during the fighting for St. Vith, he had estimated the American forces facing his 5th Panzer Army at a division, perhaps an entire corps. The defense had seemed too strong, too flexible, too well coordinated to be anything less. In reality, Clark had commanded approximately 2,500 men. The disparity between German perception and American reality stemmed directly from radio coordination. Clark's handful of defenders moved constantly, appearing in one position, delivering devastating fire, then relocating before the Germans could respond. American artillery, directed by forward observers in real-time communication with gun batteries miles to the rear, fell with devastating accuracy on any German concentration. Every American unit knew where every other American unit was operating. The Germans faced an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. Military historian Russell Weigley later wrote that more than any other of the many defensive stands in the Ardennes, It was the Battle of St. Vith that bought the time required by Allied generalship to recapture control of the battle. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the west, offered his own assessment of why the Ardennes offensive ultimately failed, despite initial successes. In post-war interrogations, he emphasized that the lack of fighter aircraft meant his forces had no air reconnaissance, and he considered this the decisive factor in the German defeat. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had commanded in Normandy before Rundstedt's return, was equally direct about the impact of Allied air power. In correspondence with Hitler during the summer of 1944, he described the total enemy air superiority that made movement by day virtually impossible for German forces. That air superiority was itself enabled by radio. Fighter bombers received target coordinates from forward air controllers riding with advancing tank columns. Air support requests flowed through the same FM networks that coordinated tank battalions. When a German strongpoint held up an American advance, a radio call brought aircraft overhead within minutes. The destruction of Panzer Group West's headquarters demonstrated the deadly synergy between communication and air power. On June 10, 1944, aircraft from the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force, including both B-25 Mitchell medium bombers and Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers, struck the Château de la Caine, where the German Armoured Command had established its headquarters. Intelligence from both ultra-code-breaking and high-frequency direction finding had pinpointed the location. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding German armoured forces in Normandy, was wounded. His chief of staff, General Major Sigismund Helmuth von der Waans, was killed along with 17 other staff officers. A planned German counteroffensive against the Normandy beachheads was cancelled because the headquarters that would have coordinated it no longer existed. Creighton Abrams returned from Europe wearing 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, one awarded for his actions at Arracourt on September 20, 1944, and another for the relief of Bastogne on December 26 of the same year. General George Patton himself remarked that he was supposed to be the best tank commander in the army, but he had one peer, Abe Abrams, and that Abrams was the world champion. Time magazine described the 37th Tank Battalion under Abrams' command as a fearsome weapon of destruction. During the war, Abrams commanded a succession of tanks, each named Thunderbolt and numbered consecutively. The final Thunderbolt survived to the war's end and is preserved today. After victory, Abrams served as Director of Tactics at the Armoured School at Fort Knox from 1946 through 1948. He helped codify the lessons of combined arms warfare for a new generation of officers who would fight in Korea and Vietnam. The doctrine he taught emphasized coordination, communication, and the integration of all combat elements into a unified force. Abrams rose to 4-star general and served as Army Chief of Staff until his death from complications of lung cancer surgery on September 4, 1974. 6 years later, on February 28, 1980, the Army's new main battle tank was officially designated the M1 Abrams. His widow Julia christened the first production vehicle with champagne at the Lima Army Tank Plant in Ohio. The tank that bears his name today carries communication equipment that Edwin Armstrong could never have imagined. Digital encrypted data links share information between vehicles automatically. GPS receivers pinpoint position to within meters. Satellite communication connects tank commanders to higher headquarters anywhere in the world. The Blue Force tracker system shows every friendly vehicle on a screen, making coordination instantaneous and automatic. The fundamental principle remains unchanged across 8 decades. The force that communicates better will outfight the force that merely shoots better. German tanks were engineering marvels. The Panther's combination of firepower, armor, and mobility represented the pinnacle of Second World War tank design. The Tiger was a battlefield terror whose very appearance could cause Allied tank crews to abandon their vehicles rather than face its 88mm gun. German tank crews were often magnificently trained, the product of a military culture that had been preparing for armored warfare since the 1920s. Yet the war ended with German armor burned out in defensive positions across Europe, while Sherman crews rolled into Germany as conquerors. The difference was not in the steel or the gunpowder. It was in the information. The ability to know where your enemy was before he knew where you were. The ability to coordinate with your comrades without exposing yourself to enemy fire. The ability to concentrate force at decisive points before the enemy could react. These capabilities flowed through radio waves at the speed of light, carried by FM transmitters that weighed 181 pounds and reached across 7 miles of battlefield chaos. Every Sherman tanker who came home after the war owed a debt he may never have understood, a debt to a Columbia professor who died in despair in 1954, a debt to a Signal Corps colonel who made the right choice at Fort Monmouth in 1938 when the safe choice pointed the other way, a debt to a Polish immigrant engineer in a Chicago factory who designed the circuits that made it all work. The next time you hear someone debate whether the Sherman was a good tank or a death trap, remember Arracourt, remember Bastogne, remember Saint-Vith. Remember that the kill ratio favored the supposedly inferior American tank by margins that should have been impossible. Remember that German troops never expected American Sherman tanks had the world's most advanced radios, and that made all the difference.